Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more Testament of Hope, the speeches and writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we are reading some more of Where Do We Go From Here? So let's hop into it. Chapter 2, Black Power. James Meredith has been shot. It was about 3 o'clock uh, on a Monday in June of 1966. And I was presiding over the regular staff meeting. Get some light on this situation. Over the regular staff meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in our Atlanta headquarters, when we heard that Meredith had been shot in the back only a day after he had begun the Freedom March through Mississippi. There was a momentary hush of anger and dismay throughout the room. Our horror was compounded by the fact that the early reports announced that Meredith was dead. Soon the silence was broken, and from every corner of the room came expressions of anger and outrage. The business of the meeting was forgotten in the shock of the latest evidence that a Negro life was still worthless in many parts of his own country. When order was finally restored, our executive staff immediately agreed that the march must continue. After all, we reasoned, Meredith had begun his lonely journey as a pilgrimage against fear. Wouldn't failure to continue only intensify the fears of the oppressed and deprived Negroes of Mississippi? Would this not be a setback for the whole civil rights movement and a blow to the nonviolent discipline? After several calls between Atlanta and Memphis, we learned that the earlier reports of Meredith's death were false and that he would recover. The news brought relief, but it also did not alter our feelings that the civil rights movement had a moral obligation to continue along the path that Meredith had begun. The next morning, I was off to Memphis along with several members of the staff. Floyd McKissick, National Director of CORE, flew in from New York and joined us on the flight from Atlanta to Memphis. After landing, we went directly to the municipal hospital to visit Meredith. We were happy to find him resting well. After expressing our sympathy and gratitude for his courageous witness, Floyd and I shared our conviction with him and that the march should continue in order to demonstrate to the nation that the world that Negroes would never again be intimidated by the terror of the extremist white violence. Realizing that Meredith was often a loner and he was probably wanted to continue the march without a large group, we felt that it would take a great deal of persuasion to convince him that the issue involved the whole civil rights movement. Fortunately, he soon saw this and agreed that we should continue without him. We spent some time discussing the character and logistics of the march and agreed that we would consult with him daily on every decision. As we prepared to leave, the nurse came in the door and said, "Mr. Meredith, where is Mr. Car? There is a Mr. Carmichael in the lobby who would like to see you and Dr. King. Should I give him permission to come in?" Meredith consented. Stokely Carmichael entered with his associate, Cleveland Sellers, and immediately reached out for Meredith's hand. He expressed his concern and admiration and brought messages of sympathy from his colleagues in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. After a brief conversation, we all agreed that James should get some rest and that we should not burden him with any additional talk. We left the room assuring him that we would conduct the march in his spirit and would seek as never before to expose the ugly racism that pervaded Mississippi and to arouse a new sense of dignity and manhood in every Negro who inhabited that bastion of man's inhumanity to man. In a brief conference, Floyd, Stokely, and I agreed that the march should be jointly sponsored by CORE, SNCC, and SCLC, with the understanding that all other civil rights organizations would be invited to join. It was also agreed that we would issue a national call for support and participation. 1 hour later, after making staff assignments and setting up headquarters in the Reverend James Lawson's church in Memphis, a group of us packed into 4 automobiles and made our way to that desolate spot on Highway 51 where James Meredith had been shot the day before. So began the second stage of the Meredith, Mississippi Freedom March. As we walked down the meandering highway in the sweltering heat, there was much talk and many questions were raised. "I'm not for that nonviolent stuff anymore," shouted one of the younger activists. "If one of those damn white Mississippi crackers touches me, I'm going to knock the hell out of him," shouted another. Later on, a discussion of the composition of the march came up. "This should be an all-black march," said one marcher. "We don't need any more white phonies and liberals invading our movement. This is our march." Once during the afternoon, we stopped to sing "We Shall Overcome." The voices rang out with all the traditional fervor, the glad thunder and gentle strength that had always characterized the singing of this noble song. But when we came to the stanza which speaks of black and white together, the voices of a few of the marchers were muted. I asked them later why they refused to sing that verse. The retort was, "This is a new day. We don't sing those words anymore. In fact, the whole song should be discarded. Not 'we shall overcome,' but 'we shall overrun.'" As I listened to these comments, the words fell on my ears like strange music from a foreign land. My hearing was not attuned to the sound of such bitterness. I guess I should not have been surprised. I should have known that in an atmosphere where false promises are daily realities, where deferred dreams are nightly facts, and acts of unpunished violence toward Negroes are a way of life, nonviolence would eventually be seriously questioned. I should have been reminded that disappointment produces despair, and despair produces bitterness, and that the one thing certain about bitterness is its blindness. Bitterness has not the capacity to make the distinction between some and all. When some members of the dominant group, particularly those in power, are racist in attitude and practice, bitterness accuses the whole group. At the end of the march that first day, we all went back to Memphis and spent the night in a Negro motel, since we had not yet secured the tents that would serve as shelter each of the following nights on our journey. The discussion continued at the motel. I decided that I would plead patiently with my brothers to remain true to the time-honored principles of our movement. I began with a plea for nonviolence. This immediately aroused some of our friends from the Deacons for Defense, who contended that self-defense was essential and that therefore nonviolence should not be a prerequisite for participation in the march. They were joined in this view by some of the activists from CORE and SNCC. I tried to make it clear that besides opposing violence in principle, I could imagine nothing more impractical and disastrous than for any of us, through misguided judgment, to participate in a violent confrontation in Mississippi. We had neither the resources nor the techniques to win. Furthermore, I asserted many Mississippi whites from the government on down should enjoy nothing more than for us to turn to violence in order to use this as an excuse to wipe out scores of Negroes in and out of the march. Finally, I contended that the debate over the question of self-defense was unnecessary, since few people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. The question was not whether one should use his gun when his home was attacked, but whether it was tactically wise to use a gun while participating in an organized demonstration. If they lowered the banner of nonviolence, I said, Mississippi injustice would not be exposed and the moral issues would be obscured. Next, the question of participation of whites was raised. Stokely Carmichael contended that the inclusion of whites in the march should be de-emphasized and that the dominant appeal should be for black participation. Others in the room agreed. As I listened to Stokely, I thought about the years that we had worked together in communities all across the South and how joyously we had then welcomed and accepted our white allies in the movement. What accounted for this reversal in Stokely's philosophy? I surmised that much of the change had its psychological roots in the experience of SNCC in Mississippi during the summer of 1964, when a large number of northern white students had come down to help in that racially torn state. What the SNCC workers saw was that the most articulate, powerful, and self-assured young people coming to work with the poorest of the Negro people and simply overwhelming them. That summer, Stokely and others in SNCC had probably unconsciously concluded that this was no good for Negroes, for it simply increased their sense of their own inadequacies. Of course, the answer to this dilemma was not to give up, not to conclude that blacks must work with blacks in order for Negroes to gain a sense of their own meaning. The answer was only to be found in persistent trying, perpetual experimentation, preserving togetherness. Like life, racial understanding was not something that we find, but something that we must create. What we find when we enter those mutual planes is existence, but existence is the raw material out of which all life must be created. A productive and happy life is not something that you find, it is something that you make, and the ability of Negroes and whites to work together to understand each other will not be found ready made. It must be created by the fact of the content. Along these lines, I implored everyone in the room to see the morality of making the march completely interracial. Consciences must be enlisted in our movement. I said, not merely racial groups. I reminded them of the dedicated whites who had suffered, bled, and died in the cause of racial justice, and suggested that to reject the white participation now would be a shameful repudiation of all for which they had sacrificed. Finally, I said that the formidable foe was now faced we now face demanded more dignity, unity than ever before, and that I would stretch every point to maintain this unity, but that I could not, in good conscience, agree to continue any personal involvement and that of the SCLC in the march if it were not publicly affirmed that it was based on nonviolence and the participation of both black and white. After a few more minutes of discussion, Floyd and Stokely agreed that we could unite around these principles as far as the march was concerned. The next morning, we had a joint press conference affirming that the march was nonviolent and that whites were welcomed. As the days progressed, debates and discussions continued, but they were usually pushed to the background by the onrush of enthusiasm engendered by the large crowds that turned out to greet us in every town. We had been marching for about 10 days when we passed through Grenada on the way to Greenwood. Stokely did not conceal his growing eagerness to reach Greenwood. This was SNCC territory on the sense that the organization had worked courageously there during the turbulent summer of 1964. As we approached the city, large crowds of old friends and new turned out to welcome us. At a huge mass meeting that night, which was held in a city park, Stokely mounted the platform and after arousing its audience with a powerful attack on Mississippi justice, he proclaimed, "What we need is black power." Willie Rocks, the fiery orator of SNCC, leapt to the platform and shouted, "What do you want?" The crowd roared, "Black power!" Again and again, Ricks cried, "What do you want?" And the response, "Black power!" grew louder and louder until it had reached fever pitch. So Greenwood turned out to be the arena for the birth of the Black Power slogan in the civil rights movement. The phrase had been used long before by Richard Wright and others, but never until that night had it been used as a slogan for the civil rights movement. For people who had been crushed so long by white power and who had been taught that black was degrading, it was a ready appeal. Immediately, however, I had reservations about its use. I had the deep feeling that it was an unfortunate choice of words for a slogan. Moreover, I saw it as bringing about division within the ranks of the marchers. For a day or two, there was fierce competition between those who were wedded to the Black Power slogan and those wedded to the Freedom Now speakers. On each side sought desperately to get the crowds to chant their slogan the loudest. Sensing this widening split in our ranks, I asked Stokely and Floyd to join me in a frank discussion of the problem. We met the next morning along with the members of each of our staffs in a small Catholic parish house in Yazoo City. For 5 long hours, I pleaded with the group to abandon the Black Power slogan. It was my contention that a leader was to be concerned about the problem of semantics. Each word, I said, had a denotative meaning, its explicit and recognized sense, and a connotative meaning, its suggestive sense. While the concept of legitimate black power might be denotatively sound, the slogan Black Power carried the wrong connotations. I mentioned the implication of violence that the press had already attached to the phrase, and I went on to say that for some of the rash attempts on the part of a few marchers only reinforced this impression. Stokely replied by saying that the question of violence versus nonviolence was irrelevant. The real question was the need for black people to consolidate their power and economic resources to achieve power. Power, he said, is the only thing respected in this world, and we must get it at any cost. Then he looked me squarely in the eye and said, Martin, you know as well as I do that practically every other ethnic group in America has done just this. The Jews, the Irish, the Italians did it. Why can't we? That is just the point, I answered. No one has ever heard the Jews publicly chant a slogan of Jewish power, but they have power. Through group unity, determination, and creative endeavor, they have gained it. And the same thing is true of the Irish and Italians. Neither group has used a slogan of Irish or Italian power, but they have worked hard to achieve it. This is exactly what we must do, I said. We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. We must work to build racial pride and refute the notion that black is evil and ugly. But this must come through a program, not merely through a slogan. Stokely and Floyd insisted that the slogan itself was important. How can you rouse people to unite around a program without a slogan as a rallying cry? Didn't the labor movement have slogans? Haven't we had slogans all along in the freedom movement? What we need is a new slogan with black in it. I conceded the fact that we must have slogans, but why have one that would confuse our allies, isolate the Negro community, and give many prejudiced whites who might otherwise be ashamed of their anti Negro feeling a ready excuse for self justification? Why not use the slogan Black Consciousness or Black Equality? I suggested. These phrases would be less vulnerable and would more accurately describe what we are about. The words black and power together give an impression that we are talking about black domination rather than black equality. Stokely responded that neither would be ready appeal and persuasive force of black power. Throughout the lengthy discussion, Stokely and Floyd remained adamant, and Stokely concluded by saying with candor, Martin, I deliberately decided to raise this issue on the march in order to give it a national forum and force you to take a stand for black power. I laughed. I have been used before, I said to Stokely. One more time won't hurt. The meeting ended with the SCLC staff members still agreeing with me that the slogan was unfortunate and could only divert attention from the evils of Mississippi, while most core and SNCC staff members joined Stokely and Floyd in insisting that it should be projected nationally. In a final attempt to maintain unity, I suggested that we compromise by not chanting either Black Power or Freedom Now for the rest of the march. In this way, neither the people nor the press would be confused about the apparent conflict, and staff members would not appear to be at loggerheads. They all agreed with this compromise. But while the chant died out, the press kept the debate going. News stories now centered not on the injustices of Mississippi, but on the apparent ideological division in the civil rights movement. Every revolutionary movement has its peaks of united activity and its valleys um, of debate and internal conflict. This debate might well have been little more than a healthy internal discussion or internal difference of opinion, but the press loves the sensational and it could not allow the issue to remain within the private domain of the movement. In every drama, there has to be an antagonist and protagonist, and the antagonist is not, and if the antagonist is not there, the press will find and build one. So, yeah, Dr. King picking up the march from Meredith, along with members of the SNCC, the core, and his own SCLC. And not too long in, they run into this ideological difference of how they feel they were presenting themselves. Stokely Carmichael and the SNCC were already wary of white participation. But King felt we need to be inclusive and nonviolent. We want them to have no other choice than to treat us fairly. So yeah, that will be the end of this episode. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite the sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.